I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Atul Arya, Senior VP and Chief Energy Strategist at S&P Global. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me,
Yes.
Marino.
As African countries seek to utilize their endowment of natural resources to improve energy access, to what degree can local operators leverage clean energy to decarbonize the energy sector at a local level?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and important question. I think there are many things both local operators and the international oil companies operating in Africa are doing at a minimum level for the power needs. Whether you're in an FPSO or an onshore, you can use renewable power. Solar being a very common source of the renewable power, and we are already seeing that happening. Stopping all the venting and flaring in the gas fields, particularly offshore. Those are some of the more very important practices. Also, methane emission leaks. There's so much gas development on the continent that we're going to hear much more, I think, around methane emissions. And I think that's one very good thing. The technology is there to detect that. So that's another area. And energy efficiency. So one of the challenges we see is that a lot of the fields in Africa, local operators are operating mature fields. So they need to revamp the operations, and energy efficiency is kind of good, in my view, good for all seasons, because you save money. It's money in the bank by not wasting energy, and it's good for the environment. So a whole range of things. And I think I would say, to close, companies are doing a lot. They know this is a really important thing. Public is looking at it. It's a license to operate. Regulators want this to be addressed, the emissions from operations. So a lot of activity, and the technology. Just very briefly, like for example, methane emissions. We have now technology, not just the satellite technology, but local technology like a drones and all, which can detect the leaks at a much higher precision, and then you can address the leaks.
And could you just provide an overview of the risks involved in sourcing critical minerals from Africa and how developed economies' dominance over global supply chains can help strengthen the continent's economic outlook?
So here is, in my view, one kind of the biggest opportunities. In some ways, potentially as big as oil and gas. It's critical minerals development all over the continent in Africa. And as we all know, right now, 70% of critical mineral processing, higher for some things, low for overall 70 is in China. So there are many countries in the world, the US and Europe, who want to diversify the supply chains. So for Africa, there are several things to be done. One is critical minerals, development is going to be very energy intensive, particularly electricity intensive, right? So there are countries, for example, Angola has surplus electricity, surplus gas. So could Angola connect with some of the other neighboring countries and send clean electricity for these mining operations? I think that would be a good way to both collaborate and also help make a more sustainable mining. I think the other issue always there is, how are these mines being developed? So best practices in terms of impact on local communities. When we talk about just energy transition, I think we also need to talk about just minerals transition, because the minerals have sometimes even more impact. If you're in an offshore oil field, it has no impact on population. But if you are on onshore, most of the mining is onshore, almost 99%, that those communities, they have to be cared for when you're displacing them for mining operations. Yeah.
And how will high interest rates on investment and uncertainty over future energy policies impact the renewable energy sector in Africa?
Yeah. So by the way, high interest rates impact everything, right? They impact both the oil and gas development, but also the renewables development. So there is an impact, already happening, in the sense that the cost of capital has gone up. And actually, one thing we are working on in S&P Global is, why is the cost of capital for Africa so much higher than, sometimes 5-6%, even higher than that, higher than, say, in Europe or in the US. So there are issues around regulations, transparency, capacity building, and all of these issues need to be addressed. I think the good news is that globally the interest rates are coming down, and that should help. So that's one thing. But in terms of addressing it, I think there's kind of what I would call their root issues, which need to be addressed to not just have the interest rate will come down only so much. After that, the premium, the risk premium, which is added to investments in Africa, both renewables and fossil fuel. That has to come down. And I think I see a lot of actions, including by the international banks, the IMF and the World Bank and so on, to address that the risk premium issue on cost of borrowing.
And could you just provide an overview of how private markets in Africa are actively contributing to the supply of capital funding for infrastructure projects, especially in the clean energy sector?
Yeah, so I think that's again kind of interesting developments. I've been coming here for a few years to Africa Energy Week, and I saw today, this morning, this big announcement by X Bank, collaborating with a number of countries, and then also creating this Africa Energy Bank, which will hopefully bring more capital. So there is, people say, well, there is not enough money. I think there is a lot of money around the world, maybe not enough coming into Africa, which is true. But what we really need to do is to have private capital from Africa, but also private capital from outside of Africa coming into Africa. And I think that is happening, although not necessarily in Africa, but Middle East investors are very interested in investing in infrastructure in Africa. So more private money is coming in. But in general, my feeling is that because of sort of, both perceived risks and for safety, many private investors would like to have a public-private partnership type model where they're investing, but there is some public government investment, so that the risks are, reduced to some extent, or at least the perception is reduced to some extent. And I think we are seeing that still a lot more money has to come into Africa. That's everybody knows that.
Yeah. And how can IOCs and operators active in African oil and gas industry further leverage carbon capture and storage technologies to enable decarbonization on the continent's industrial economy?
Yeah. So carbon capture is going through, and I've spent a lot of time in my career working on carbon capture, and I always joke, I don't have much to show for it. Hopefully that will change, right? But the thing is that carbon capture, if you look at the whole continent, the only place where it is currently happening is in Algeria, actually through gas processing, where the CO2 from gas processing being injected. The technology is still, being developed or deployed, I should say, in Europe and in Africa, in the US, and I think that's kind of where the lead is going to be in Africa. Well, again, because of risks and the cost. Costs are very high, and everywhere the technology is currently being deployed is through some government incentive. In the US, it is through the Inflation Reduction Act. There is huge amount of incentive for carbon capture. There is no such incentive in Africa. It will be very expensive. Yeah. So the technology has to be perfected there. But we are seeing some signs of companies looking to see, particularly IOCs who have a large climate commitment, and if they find, for example, a gas resource which has high CO2 content, they're going to do things to separate CO2, and CO2 has no value to sell, so to re-inject. And we have seen some of this happening, for example, in Indonesia, in Asia. So I think that kind of technology is going to come over time to Africa. But in a way, I'm okay with that, because the risks can be mitigated. Technology could be perfected elsewhere and then be deployed at scale in Africa.
And, this year's African Energy Week, the theme is Invest in African Energy. And to what degree can, industry players, policymakers leverage this theme, and develop policy frameworks and financing models for the energy sector?
Yeah, this is a really great question, because we just had a little bit of conversation in the panel I did. In my mind, the power of narrative is very important, right? What you hear about and what you see about a country or a continent, that carries for, people who are not physically there and physically experiencing it. So we had this conversation that, in Africa Energy Week is the conference, and it's got a lot of important people here. And I feel, there will be deals made, and that's great. But that narrative, which is being shared here, I think has to also go out to other places in the world, other events, other conferences, to say, look, this is what is happening in Africa. Come and see us. Come and experience it. I think, we signed. There were 3 deals signed this morning on the main stage on kind of projects type deal. We signed a deal S&P partnering with Africa Energy Chamber, but outside of that, so I see more more collaboration with banks here in Africa, and also with investors from South Africa. But I think the message has to be communicated everywhere that
Yeah.
Africa has a lot of opportunities. It's a stable market. The regulations are improving. Collaboration is improving. I think that kind of confidence is needed for other companies and investors to come in. And I mentioned in the meeting, in the panel, that we as S&P Global have an event called Sarah Week every year in March, and we hope that there will be more people from here go there to share their message,
Yeah.
talk about what is happening in Africa.
And just my final question, like, how do you foresee like the frameworks creating synergies between fossil fuels as well as the renewable energy technologies on the continent?
A big issue, right? As to is one better than the other. So let me start by saying that look, in the world of energy transition, it's really been what I have called energy addition. Nothing has, no fuel has ever disappeared. We're still using biomass, right? And
Yeah.
and cow dung, if I can
Yeah.
say so. So I think we're going to continue with those fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, but we are going to bring in more renewable energy. So one example which has come up a lot here, Africa right now is awash in gas. So a framework which has gas integrating with the renewables will be a very good thing for countries to do, not just each country, but across several countries together. Because one other thing we see is that there is, some places have a lot of gas but not enough market, but other places need power but have no fuel. So can you bring in that gas and then integrate that with solar and wind? Africa has the best solar resource there is in the world. So, and solar is so cheap now. So bring in solar, integrate with natural gas. That's a one easy thing to do. Other thing which we think is going to happen here is, with as more oil gets developed, some of that oil, rather than being exported or used in transportation, may go into petrochemicals, and then you're actually capturing that carbon into petrochemicals, and that's captured for forever. And here in Africa, the consumption of base chemicals is so low per capita. There's a
Yeah.
huge pent up demand, so there's could be some more petrochemical operations as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. It has been a pleasure to meet you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.